actually based out of Berlin. I work for ThoughtWorks in Berlin, and I want to talk to you today about pair programming, so the practice of two people creating code together sitting in front of a computer. And it's an agile development practice that I think is generally quite well known, but actually still has patchy adoption across the industry, I would say. And for those of you who are not convinced that it's really useful or maybe only use it irregularly, I hope to give you some new inspiration to maybe try it or try it again. And those of you who are regular pairers or maybe even passionate advocates, maybe I can give you some new ideas and help you convince other people to try it. And I'll actually start at the very beginning in the 1940s with the first programmers. So on this picture, you can see Gene Bartik and Betty Snyder in front of the ENIAC computer, which is by many considered to be one of the very first electronic computers, and the ENIAC women, the first programmers. So they had to figure out what to do and how to do it effectively before the word programming even existed. And this is a quote from a 2011 interview with Gene Bartik. And she says here that Betty Snyder and I, from the beginning, were a pair. And I believe that the best programs and designs are done by pairs because you can criticize each other, find each other's errors, and use the best ideas. And when I saw this interview first, it blew my mind a little bit, because here were these very first programmers who didn't have any role models to tell them how to do this, and they came to the conclusion that it would be useful if they worked on this as a pair. So fast forward 50 years later, so it took us 50 years for pair programming to become a more widely spread term, when Kent Beck described it in the late 90s as one of the practices under the label extreme programming. And at ThoughtWorks, we're a consultancy, so each situation we get into, we kind of tune the practices, approaches, technologies that we need to use. However, there are a few core values and practices that we see as crucial to successful and sustainable software delivery. And our colleague Evan Botcher wrote about this set of core values and practices last year on our company blog, ThoughtWorks Insights. And pair programming is one of those core practices that we as a group generally agree on, that it's really at the core of successful software development. But there's still lots of discussion on the details, as you can see from some of the subject lines I pulled out from our most vibrant internal mailing list. And a vast majority of the clients that we work with have often not had pair programming as a common practice when we get there. And also, on average, they often resist to it much more than to some of the other practices like test-driven development. As you can see, some of us are struggling with this from these other subjects here, like client wants to stop pair programming, what should we do? Also, most of the applicants for a developer job with ThoughtWorks in Germany, at least I see, have not had much prior experience with pair programming. Same for me when I started 5 years ago. I hadn't actually done it that much. So why is it not more widely adopted? I think there are two main reasons. The first one is that it's a long game. So you can see short-term benefits, like less errors, less rework, but ultimately, for me, it's about medium to long-term consistent quality and maintainability. And as developers, we like the short-term gratification of seeing something work today, immediately, right? And that's actually something, maybe one of the things we share with project managers. And for them, pair programming also feels counterintuitive. Doesn't it have the productivity of developers? And Martin actually said in 2006, actually 12 years ago in this blog post, that his flippant answer to that one is, that would be true if the hardest part of programming was typing. So it's actually not about the number of lines of code, right? It's about productivity and effectiveness, and those two things are very hard to measure. The second reason why I think it's not as widely adopted as maybe it should be is simply that it's hard. One does not simply pair programming. You don't just sit two people together in front of a computer and it just clicks and it just works, right? So what I want to do is I want to talk a little bit about some of the reasons how pair programming increases effectiveness, the effectiveness you can't measure. Then also talk a bit about what's hard about it and some ways to tackle that. And then finally, after talking about those challenges, a little bit about, is it really worth the hassle? So I'll start with effectiveness. And the first category there is really about that 1 + 1 in pair programming is greater than 2. So the probably most commonly mentioned and well understood benefit of pair programming is knowledge sharing, or complementing your knowledge to come to a better outcome. Just the practice of pair programming does not guarantee that, though. People need to move around, break up knowledge silos. Maybe not everybody needs to see everything, but still pair programming makes it easier to share the ownership of the code across the team, and it also makes it less scary to move around. The second thing is that it enables you to combine two modes of thinking. So the typer can actually be in a more tactical mindset, really focus on the lines of code at hand, maybe the local optimization of what's going on, whereas the person sitting next to the typer can take a step back and look at the big picture, maybe already think about the next problem you're going to run into, write that down, and really take advantage of that. It's actually a common thing sometimes that other person also is in tactical mode, and then you might not get as much out of pair programming as you could. And thirdly, it really helps you reflect, not just on the code, but also on the story, what value it brings, or what value it might not bring. And this really goes into what I mentioned before about effectiveness versus number of lines of code, because that reflection with each other might actually maximize the number of lines of code that you're not writing and that you will not have to maintain in the future. So secondly, it really helps you focus. For example, pairing has also, when I'm working solo, given me a lot more discipline around the structure, how I approach, how I plan my tasks. And when I pair with someone, I'm also forced to explain and justify why I want to take a certain direction and discuss that with the other person. So it helps me avoid the famous rabbit holes. Or as one of our colleagues said it recently on Twitter, I get more programming productivity out of reducing the time that I'm stuck than from increasing my speed when I'm not stuck. So it helps with focus for the pairers, but also focus for the team. So introducing a work in progress limit for a team can have a huge impact on the team's flow and ability to deliver good quality. So let's say you introduce a work in progress limit of 3 or 4 stories, and you have a 2-pizza team, then pairing is almost a natural consequence. And it helps you really reduce the number of balls your team needs to have in the air at the same time. And lastly, pairing helps you practice true continuous integration. So what do I mean by true continuous integration? So you get code review on the go, you get more collective code ownership, and both of those things help you practice trunk-based development, so really frequent integration. So the code review on the go, code review after the fact has a few disadvantages over code review on the go, I think. So one of them is that sometimes as a reviewer, you're kind of in a sunk cost fallacy mode. So you think, yeah, this is maybe not the greatest, but it already works, so it's maybe too much hassle to build it again. So you might not, this immediacy of the code review on the go really helps catch more things. And also a code review process can quickly become a bottleneck to that frequent integration that you have. And the collective code ownership I mentioned before, so the moving around, can actually increase the developers' trust for each other, so you feel better pushing things into trunk more often. And the State of DevOps report and the Accelerate book were also mentioned before. So the State of DevOps report actually found a correlation between high-performing teams and short integration cycles. So at this point, maybe, so I've kind of given a few of the benefits and maybe convinced some of you that pairing can lead to more effective teams, but unfortunately it doesn't always. So it can also be more harmful than helpful because, as I mentioned before, it's not that easy. So one thing that people often say about it is that it's exhausting, right? So it's energy draining. And something that maybe sounds like obvious advice, but that we see often with teams that really want to embrace pair programming, they actually pair 8 hours a day and just don't do that. It's just too much. And also when you work solo, you don't code all day, right? You have other things to do, and there's more things to do to complete a story than just code. So really take that into account, plan your day together, and try to find a good balance there. Also, taking breaks also seems obvious, but is often forgotten, or maybe you don't want to bring it up if your pairing partner seems more energized and you don't want to admit that that you need a break. And one way that can help here is time management techniques like Pomodoro, where you have like slots of 25 minutes times with an alarm clock and breaks in between. Just think about switching roles and modes how you do this. So it doesn't have to be 100% pair coding. You don't have to be joined at the hip all day. It's actually about pair development as well. And then, you know, some of those energy problems can actually be solved, and it's not that hard. But I think at the core of why it's challenging is really that it's a really intense mode of collaboration. So it's really important that you give each other feedback. And pairing is also a great way to practice this, because you can do it in small chunks every day after you've paired with somebody, and you have a very clear goal of the feedback, which is to improve your collaboration. Also, when you first pair with someone, take some time to talk about how each of you like to work. So on my team, we've recently played around with the idea of writing READMEs for ourselves and then sharing them with each other. So try out a few things that maybe you haven't tried before. Tell each other your pet peeves, like I don't like it when somebody's eating next to me, stuff like that. So the awareness of these differences and how that relates to pairing is really important. For example, if you are pairing up a really experienced person with an absolute novice, that can sometimes just not go very well, and that's okay. Maybe you don't pair those people up if it's not working out. And finally, pairing is hard because it's very personal. So you're sharing a close physical space, you're sharing your computers, your messy desktop, you're exposing which IDE shortcuts you don't know. And how big of a deal this actually is dawned on me first when I read a blog post by Tom Howlett titled "The Shame of Pair Programming." And in there he says, to pair requires vulnerability. It means sharing all that you know and all that you don't know. And this is hard for us. And he goes on to say, programmers are supposed to be smart. Most people look at what we do and say, I could never do that. And it makes us feel a bit special, gives us a sense of pride, and pride creates invulnerability. And I think this also goes back to what Jean Bartik found so great about pairing. She said you can criticize each other and find each other's errors. But if you're not open to that, to exposing what you don't know, then that actually creates more problems than it's beneficial. So this works best in a very positive and safe team environment where everybody really believes in the prime directive that everybody is doing the best job that they can with the information at hand and in the context. After I talked about these tough challenges to get those benefits, I want to finish on talking about, is it really worth the hassle then? So you will be more successful at pair programming if you work on all the skills helpful to overcome those challenges. Concentration, for example, is actually something you can practice. Task organization, time management, communication, giving and receiving feedback, empathy, vulnerability. And the list might seem daunting for just this one extra practice you do, but actually those are all things that you need on a team anyway. So if you want like a good gel team, you need those anyway. And pair programming gives you a chance to work on them, even if that might feel uncomfortable at first. So I went to the Lead Developer Conference in London a few weeks ago, and I saw Pia Nilsson from Spotify speak there. And she talked about how when they introduced all these practices to improve flow, so a work in progress limit, test-driven development, pair programming, mob programming. So that was all great in theory, but it actually kind of reduced the fun on the team and increased the friction, so anxiety and conflict and stuff like that. And I think another factor you could add here to this graph of increasing friction is diversity. So it's also something that's generally talked about as something that improves team performance, but often at first it increases friction between people. And diversity on a team can also actually increase the challenges with pair programming I talked about before. And things like being vulnerable are often harder or even more risky for people on the team from underrepresented groups because you're kind of more exposed. So I read this article on Harvard Business Review. Diverse teams feel less comfortable, and that's why they perform better. And they're saying in there that homogeneous teams feel easier, but easy is bad for performance. And that seems a bit weird, right? So the authors are also saying this idea goes against many people's intuition. And often if there's something counterintuitive, there's a cognitive bias hidden away somewhere, right? So, and the one that they're mentioning here is the fluency heuristic, which says that we prefer information that is more easily processed. And if it's easily processed, we think that it's more true, more right, more beautiful. And that serves us very well in a lot of situations in software development. I think we want readable code, easily processable things, but I don't think it serves us well if we think that's why we're not doing pair programming. So pairing feels hard, but that doesn't mean it's not good for performance, and also it doesn't have to stay hard. And I've talked so much about how it's really hard that I just want to mention once that this is actually a benefit that a lot of my colleagues mention almost immediately in their top 3 about pairing, that's actually fun. So for those of you who've had bad experiences, it can actually be fun, promise. And if you aren't there yet, then there are ways to make it easier. So Pia went on to talk about what they did to reduce that friction, that conflict, the anxiety. She talked about feedback, nonviolent communication, psychological safety, humility, positive retros, a sense of purpose for the team. So I really recommend, if you're interested in this, that you watch her talk. And maybe what Kat just talked about also fits in here as possible solutions. So pair programming, extreme programming, agile as a whole is all about embracing change, because we realize that change is inevitable, so we want to prepare for it. And I think another thing we should embrace and prepare for is this friction that I just talked about, because it's also inevitable on the way to becoming a high-performing team. And I don't mean by that, let's just have conflicts all the time and feel uncomfortable, but let's prepare the tools to deal with this as a default, not just when a team is doing badly. So practice feedback, practice better communication, all those things. And I'm ending a talk on pairing with this because I believe pair programming is often avoided because of those potential conflicts and because it's so personal. But if you consciously see it as a skill that you can develop and that it actually helps you get better at other things as well, then you prepare yourself and the team for the inevitable friction that you will get on a diverse and high-performing team, and you will collaborate better as a whole. And maybe almost like an unconscious continuing the heritage. I have a lot of amazing women developers around me right now who are pushing the conversations about pair programming and trying to make everybody better at it. So I wanted to end on that.